I jolted awake to the shriek of metal on wood. Something massive was slamming into my backyard fence at the crack of dawn. My heart hammered so hard I could taste adrenaline in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still trapped in a nightmare or facing a real threat. Floodlights cut through the gray morning, revealing an excavator roaring like an enraged beast. Workers in neon vests barked orders I couldn't make out, while my old dog Chester tore across the lawn, barking in frantic alarm. This wasn't a simple construction project. It felt like an invasion. I sprinted outside, half in pajamas, half in disbelief, only to find the ground trembling beneath my feet. My beloved shrubs, gifts from my mother, lay torn from the earth, roots dangling like severed limbs. Fury welled up inside me, but so did a chill of dread. These people wore badges with the HOA's logo, the very association I'd been paying dues to for years. Why on earth would they be demolishing my property without a word of warning? "Stop!" I yelled over the bone-rattling noise, my voice hoarse with equal parts fear and defiance. Instead of answers, I got a dismissive wave, as if I were an annoying bystander on someone else's land. My heart twisted. If the HOA was behind this, what else were they capable of? If I caved now, I could lose everything I'd worked for, everything I loved. But standing my ground would mean pitting myself against an entire organization. Yet I knew one thing. I wouldn't back down, even if it felt like I was leaping headfirst into a raging storm. A deafening clang thundered behind me, sending my pulse skyrocketing. In that terrifying second, I realized this fight was only beginning, and I had no idea how brutal it would get. Days passed, and the noise grew louder. Instead of a distant rumble, it was now close, an irritating clank, clank, clank that echoed through the neighborhood from dawn till dusk. One Saturday morning, as I was taking Chester for a walk, I decided to find the source of the racket. I followed the sound around the corner of the block, noticing fresh tire tracks in the grass near my property's fence line that definitely raised some alarm bells. I stopped, looked down, and saw the deep marks in the ground. It wasn't a random track made by a lost delivery truck. This looked more like heavy machinery had been rolling across. I felt a surge of unease because that portion of grass was on my private land, or so I believed. My fence was a few yards from it, but I knew exactly where the official boundary ended and began. The next week, an official letter arrived from the local homeowners association. They were introducing some beautification project, but the details were pretty vague. They wrote about building a pathway that connected our street to the adjacent block, supposedly making it easier for everyone to access the communal park. On paper, it seemed innocent enough, even beneficial. However, they did not specify exactly where this new pathway would be constructed, nor did they ask for my input. Typically, HOAs hold votes or at least open the floor for discussion before launching a project that might affect homeowners, but apparently something about this project was different. I scanned the letter again, finding no mention of my property. Still, those tracks outside my fence told a different story. Shortly after that, I noticed that part of my backyard was being cleared. Some old shrubs, once thick and vibrant, had been uprooted and tossed aside like trash. My heart pounded as I took in the carnage. This wasn't just a random event. Somebody had carefully uprooted them. I saw footprints, piles of loose dirt, and an orange construction net that someone had left behind. It was like a neon warning sign telling me, "Danger, something big is happening here." My temper flared. I had worked hard to cultivate that greenery. My mother had given me those shrubs as a housewarming present years ago, and I'd nurtured them with the memory of her kind smile motivating me. Seeing them tossed to the side made me seethe with anger and triggered something deeply protective within me. At first, I tried to keep things peaceful. I drove to the HOA's office in the neighborhood's community center, hoping to have a cordial chat about the situation. The woman at the front desk greeted me politely, but the moment I explained why I was there, I felt her smile freeze. She shifted uncomfortably and gave me the runaround, saying the person in charge of the project was in a meeting. I insisted I would wait as long as necessary. Minutes turned into an hour, and by then I realized they were stalling. Eventually, someone named Martin approached me, wearing a bright polo shirt with the HOA's logo embroidered on it. He forced a smile and offered a handshake that felt too limp to be genuine. When I explained my concerns, he spoke in vague terms, avoided direct answers, and promised I'd get an official update soon. Dissatisfied, I pressed him for real answers, but he just kept repeating that everything was already decided by the board and that public notice had been posted months ago. The conversation ended with me more frustrated than when I'd arrived. Back home that evening, I paced my living room, the walls seeming to close in with every anxious footstep. Chester, sensing my agitation, stayed by my side. I weighed my options. Should I hire a lawyer right away? Should I contact the city planning office? The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I decided to do some digging first. After all, knowledge is power. So I plunked myself down at my dining room table, opened my laptop, and began researching. I found the county's GIS, Geographic Information System database, which usually details property lines, public easements, and any expansions or projects funded by local municipalities. If the HOA was working with the city, there had to be a paper trail, or at least some kind of legal approval for building on private property. As I scrolled through the online records, I had a flashback to when I first bought this house. I remembered the day I signed the mountain of paperwork, verifying the boundaries of my land. The real estate agent had pointed out that there was a small utility easement at the far corner, which granted the city access to water lines running beneath a tiny slice of the yard. But that was nowhere near the fence, and definitely not where the shrubs had been uprooted. So I had a strong suspicion the HOA was overstepping, possibly by claiming an extended easement that didn't actually exist. Still, I needed proof. My frustration escalated when I found no mention of a newly approved easement in the official records. This was odd because any newly granted right-of-ways should have been recorded. I even checked city council meeting minutes in case there had been a vote. Nothing. This was looking worse and worse for the HOA because it suggested they were either incompetent or, worse, pushing a project illegally. The very next day, I confronted Martin in the parking lot of the community center. I'd gone there again after seeing no progress in my search. I carried printed copies of the property line maps from the county's website. He went pale when I showed them to him, but then he put on a defensive posture, crossing his arms and refusing to give ground. He mumbled something about how the project had been grandfathered in and claimed it was always part of the neighborhood plan. I challenged him to show me any official documentation. He danced around the question again, claiming he had to talk to the HOA board. It was infuriating. My suspicion was that the HOA was forging ahead without the necessary legal steps, hoping I wouldn't know or wouldn't care enough to stop them. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Paula, who lived 2 doors down. She wrote, "Hey, are you seeing what they're doing behind your fence? They're pouring gravel." My stomach dropped. Gravel meant they were laying the foundation for a road or a pathway. Furious, I rushed outside. Sure enough, a group of workers in orange vests was operating a small excavator and dumping gravel in a straight line that extended from the back of my property toward the next street over. It sure didn't look like any small walkway. It looked wide enough for a service road. I could see the reflection of the midday sun on the brand new chain link they'd installed along the edge of the path, basically slicing through my land. This was the moment of ignition, the moi lua bandao that jolted me into immediate action. There was no waiting around. I sprinted across the yard, hopped over the partially removed fence plank, and confronted the construction crew directly. The workers, probably just hired contractors, looked baffled at first. They paused, stared at me. Then one of them said they had official approval from the HOA. I demanded to see any permits, any piece of paper authorizing them to build on my property. They shrugged, telling me they only followed the instructions given by the project manager. They kept saying it was common property. My blood boiled. Common property? This was my land, or so all official documents had always indicated. I immediately called the sheriff's department to report a trespassing violation. An officer arrived about an hour later. He took notes, looked around, and asked the workers if they had documentation. One of them called their supervisor, who later arrived in a pickup truck. He, too, insisted that everything was legitimate, but offered no written proof. The officer ended up telling me, politely, that this was a civil matter and I'd likely need to take it to court if there was an ownership dispute. He couldn't forcibly remove the workers if they claimed to have the HOA's permission. With that, the crew resumed their work, though they eyed me nervously, probably worried I'd do something drastic. That evening was the first time I ever felt truly powerless about something happening on my own land. But that powerlessness ignited a stubborn resolve within me. I refused to be brushed aside or bullied. I was done with half-answers, bureaucratic runarounds, and condescending responses. If the HOA wanted to fight, I was prepared to give them one. Step one was getting a lawyer, and that's exactly what I did. Early the next morning, I contacted a local attorney recommended by a friend of mine who had once fought a property dispute over boundary lines. Her name was Rachel, and from the moment we spoke on the phone, I sensed her fierce dedication. She had a fiery spirit that matched my own rage. She listened to my story carefully, asked me to email her the county records, pictures, and anything else I had. Then she told me she'd do some digging of her own. We set a meeting for the very next day. Rachel's office was just a few blocks from the courthouse. When I walked in, I saw tall shelves stacked with thick binders, each labeled with case numbers. There were boxes of documents scattered across the floor. It looked chaotic, but within that chaos I felt a pulse of determination. Rachel was well prepared, pointing out case laws from her memory, referencing local ordinances, and explaining how HOAs often try to push the boundaries of their authority. She told me we might have grounds for a restraining order to halt construction, at least temporarily, until we could sort out the legality of their project. I exhaled in relief. It was the first glimmer of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. Sure enough, a few days later, Rachel filed the necessary paperwork, citing that the HOA had no recorded easement or right-of-ways on my property. She also highlighted that the HOA failed to properly notify me and other affected homeowners about the scope of their plan. Our immediate goal was to get a judge to impose a temporary stop-work order. If we succeeded, it would buy us time to build our case without the construction continuing to wreak havoc on my yard. During this time, I started hearing whispers from other neighbors. Some were shocked that the HOA was intruding on private property. Others mentioned that they'd heard rumors about the HOA, wanting a direct route for certain board members who lived on the next street, making their commute or their route to the park more convenient. A few older neighbors recalled a vague plan from decades ago about connecting the two streets, but everyone believed it had been scrapped or was never approved. Many sympathized with me, but most were hesitant to speak up publicly, either out of fear of HOA retaliation or because they didn't want to get entangled in a legal battle. As the situation escalated, I found an unexpected ally in Paula, my neighbor who had first alerted me about the gravel. She was a longtime resident, well-liked and well-informed about local politics. She organized a small get-together at her home, inviting a handful of concerned residents. We sat in her living room, drinking lemonade and brainstorming ways to push back against what we saw as blatant overreach. Paula also introduced me to her friend Roger, who used to work for the city planning department. He brought with him a dusty binder of old neighborhood development plans that he had saved for some reason. Flipping through the pages, we found references to the original blueprint from decades ago. Indeed, there had been a proposal for a narrow walkway, but it was strictly foot traffic only, and crucially, it was planned to run alongside the city's water line, which was nowhere near my fence. Roger speculated that the HOA was either misreading these old documents or deliberately using them as a smokescreen to justify a brand new, larger road. This discovery felt like stumbling upon buried treasure. If we could prove that the HOA's road was not the same as the walkway described in those old documents, and in fact was built in a completely different location, we'd have a strong argument. Of course, we'd need to present all this evidence in court. Rachel was thrilled when she saw the binder, calling it the smoking gun we needed to show the judge that this project was something entirely new and unauthorized. Things, however, were about to get more complicated. One hot afternoon, while I was busy cataloging every piece of evidence, I heard a loud pounding on my front door. It was Martin, accompanied by another board member I recognized from the HOA newsletter, a tall woman named Linda. They barged into my living room uninvited after I opened the door, complaining that I was obstructing important community progress and threatening me with fines for failing to comply with HOA mandates. My irritation soared, but I stayed calm. I told them they had no right to be on my property without my permission, ironically pointing out their own trespassing. Martin then waved a stack of papers claiming they were official. He insisted I sign them to confirm I wouldn't interfere with the construction anymore. It was basically a forced compliance agreement. I refused, obviously. Tensions ran high. Linda threatened additional penalties, including a lien on my house if I didn't comply. That stung and triggered an even deeper sense of indignation. They were trying to intimidate me, to break my resolve. That's when I realized that they were truly desperate, or perhaps had made a major mistake they were scrambling to cover up. After Martin and Linda stormed out, I noticed that their car was parked half on my lawn. I took a picture. Then I saw them huddled, whispering, occasionally throwing glances at my house. I wondered what new scheme they might be cooking up. My face felt hot from anger, but also from an undercurrent of fear. Even though I had legal representation, the HOA board controlled a lot of the neighborhood's daily functions. They could make life miserable in little ways, from petty fines about lawn height to restricting garbage collection schedules. Yet, I also felt a wave of defiance wash over me. No matter what they tried, I'd stand my ground. This was my property, my home. If I let them bully me now, who knew what else they'd try in the future? Over the next week, the stop work order was granted by a judge, albeit on a temporary basis. Construction halted, leaving a half-finished gravel track that ended abruptly, surrounded by mounds of dirt. The place looked like a scar on the landscape. Despite this small victory, I felt no relief. I knew the fight was just beginning. Rachel encouraged me to gather more evidence. She wanted testimonies from neighbors, pictures from the earliest stages of construction, and any communication from the HOA that could show they never properly disclosed their intentions. I also started writing a day-by-day journal, documenting every interaction, every phone call, and every suspicious development. It was both exhausting and empowering, fueling my determination to see this through. In the midst of this legal storm, life carried on in odd ways. Chester still needed his walks. I still had my day job at a graphic design firm. And ironically, the once quiet neighborhood seemed to be buzzing with constant chatter about the case. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said I was just a troublemaker looking for a quick payday. Others believed the HOA had sinister motives, maybe an under-the-table deal with a local developer. Some neighbors took sides, forming invisible lines throughout the community. It felt like living in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business and lines of loyalty were being drawn whether you wanted them or not. One morning, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted a hateful message on my fence, calling me a community traitor. My heart sank. It was ugly and invasive. An act of cowardice under the cover of darkness? Of course, I painted over it, refusing to let them see how much it rattled me. But inside, I was outraged. This was no longer just about property lines. It was about intimidation, harassment, and the erosion of any sense of neighborly decency. I confided in Rachel, who reminded me to document everything. She took pictures of the vandalism and said we could report it as part of our claim. If this ended up going to trial, we wanted to show the court the full extent of the HOA's aggression, even if the spray painting was done by an anonymous supporter of theirs rather than the board itself. Weeks turned into months, and the tension in the community simmered beneath the surface. Then, at long last, came the hearing for a more permanent injunction against the HOA's construction project. It was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the county courthouse. The atmosphere was tense as I walked through the tall wooden doors, my heart pounding. I had never been in a courtroom for anything more serious than jury duty selection, and this time my home's fate was on the line. The judge was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression that gave nothing away. On the other side of the aisle, Martin and Linda were seated with their attorneys, flipping through documents. They cast smug glances in my direction, no doubt confident that they would prevail. Rachel presented our argument with clarity and conviction. She showed the property line maps, the old neighborhood development plans, photos of the construction, and the lack of any official recorded easement. She highlighted how the HOA never gave proper notice, never held a community-wide vote, and was effectively trampling on my rights. Martine's attorney tried to dismiss our evidence as outdated, claiming the old plans didn't reflect modern expansions. He said the HOA had the right to build on common areas for the betterment of the neighborhood. But Rachel countered by pointing out that my lot was clearly not designated as a common area in any official document. She also introduced testimony from Roger, the former city planner. He meticulously explained how the new construction didn't align with the original blueprint. His calm, authoritative presence seemed to make an impact on the judge. Then came a twist, something we never saw coming. The HOA's attorney produced a document we hadn't seen before, allegedly proving some sort of easement from years prior. It looked official, with a notary stamp and everything. My stomach sank momentarily, fearing we had overlooked something critical. But as Rachel examined it, I saw her lips twitch in a subtle smile. She requested permission to approach the bench and pointed out that the date on the notarization was a date the notary office was closed for renovations, a well-known local event from about a decade earlier. The judge also raised an eyebrow, asking pointed questions. Rachel explained that the city maintained a log of notaries and their office hours. The suspicious date indicated the document might have been falsified. Suddenly the courtroom crackled with tension. Martin looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Linda's face turned beet red, and their attorney stammered, trying to salvage the situation. That was the moment the entire case seemed to pivot. The judge ordered a short recess, presumably to examine the suspicious document more closely. During that recess, Martin glared at me across the hallway. His hostility was palpable, but beneath it I sensed panic. If that document was proven to be a forgery, the HOA would be in deep trouble, possibly facing legal consequences far beyond just losing the case. When the hearing resumed, the judge wasted no time stating that the document presented by the HOA's counsel appeared to be fraudulent, based on the notary's official schedule and records. The expression on Martin and Linda's faces was priceless. Shock and dismay. The judge then asked if the HOA had any other valid proof of easement. The attorney reluctantly admitted they did not. With that, the judge swiftly ruled that the construction on my property must cease permanently. The road had to be dismantled and the land returned to its prior state. Furthermore, the HOA was ordered to pay for the legal fees I'd incurred, as well as damages for the destruction of my shrubs and any other landscaping they'd ruined. The sense of victory that flooded over me was immense, almost unreal. I thought that would be the end of it. But as we all exited the courtroom, Martin confronted me in the hallway. He said something about how I had no idea who I was messing with, and that the HOA would remember this. Linda tried to calm him down, but her stern look at me spoke volumes. They weren't done with their vendetta, even if they'd lost in court. It was a chilling threat, but at that point, I refused to be intimidated. It took weeks for the construction company hired by the HOA to remove the gravel, the chain-link fence, and everything else they'd thrown onto my yard. They regraded the soil, replaced the uprooted shrubs with new ones, although they could never truly replace the sentimental value of the ones my mother had given me. The final settlement also included a requirement for the HOA to send out formal letters apologizing to the entire community for the disruption. Martin stepped down from his post soon after. Rumor had it that the fiasco caused a massive backlash within the board, forcing new elections. Linda tried to hold on to power but faced significant criticism for allowing the project to move forward in such a shady way. My personal life returned to something resembling normalcy, except for occasional hostile stares from certain neighbors who had sided with the old regime of the HOA. But many residents came to me privately to express support, relieved that someone had stood up to the board's overreach. Some asked me for advice about smaller issues they'd been having with the HOA, like questionable fines or unclear billing statements. It felt odd, almost like I'd become a local hero, or at least the one person proven to be willing to fight back. A few months later, Paula organized a block party to celebrate neighborly unity, a subtle nod to everything that had happened. People from all corners of the neighborhood showed up. Kids ran around the cul-de-sac with balloons in hand, neighbors chatted over grilled burgers, and the tense atmosphere that had prevailed for so long seemed to dissipate. Even though the shadows of the recent conflict lingered, there was a collective sense of relief. The new HOA board members gave a short speech about wanting to move forward with transparency and honesty, promising to involve residents in future projects. It was a turning point for our community, or so I hoped. The healing process for me was twofold. There was the external healing of the land, which took time as the new shrubs settled in and the scars of construction faded. Then there was the internal healing, the frustration and anxiety I'd endured, the nights of lost sleep worrying about whether I'd lose my backyard or my entire house to an unjust system. Eventually, that began to ease as well. I started sleeping better, letting go of the constant fear that a bulldozer might show up in the middle of the night. Chester picked up on my calmness too, trotting around happily, no longer barking at every rumble of a passing truck. Of course, the HOA saga became something of a legend in the neighborhood. People recounted the story of how the association tried to build a road across private property without proper authorization, only to be thwarted in court. It was a cautionary tale about overreaching power and the importance of knowing your rights. Often neighbors would say, "I'm sure glad you stood up to them," or "You show them they can't just trample over the little guy." Those comments made me smile, even though the whole ordeal was something I'd never want to experience again. If anything, I wanted to return to my quiet, unassuming life, focusing on my job, my dog, and my own little patch of grass and shrubs in the suburban sprawl. Yet every so often I still found an envelope in my mailbox that made my blood pressure spike. Sometimes it was just a standard HOA letter about tree trimming or the annual holiday lights competition, but every time I saw that logo, I'd brace myself, remembering the battles we'd fought. With the new board in place, nothing too outrageous was happening. Still, trust is a fragile thing. I made it a point to attend the HOA meetings more regularly. I realized that part of the reason the board had gotten away with so much was because people like me, who were paying dues but rarely participating, allowed them free rein. By showing up, asking questions, and forcing them to be transparent, I was doing my small part to keep future shenanigans in check. A year passed, and my life found its new normal. Most of the neighbors had moved on. People joked about the road that never was, and the land behind my fence flourished again. Flowers bloomed in place of the old shrubs. The memory of that fiasco lingered, but I felt a sense of pride that I'd fought back against something unjust. Then, one day, I found an anonymous note in my mailbox. It said, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." It wasn't signed, but it made me realize that my fight wasn't just for myself. Sometimes a single person's resistance can ripple through a community in ways they never expect. Some afternoons, I'd stand in my backyard, watching the sunlight dance through the pine trees and reflect on everything that happened. I'd think about the feeling of helplessness when the first shrubs were uprooted, and about the sense of betrayal when the HOA tried to strong-arm me. I'd recall the wave of relief and triumph when we proved in court that their so-called easement was a sham. I realized how close I came to just giving up, or caving in to their demands. It would have been easier in some ways, but it would have set a dangerous precedent. Standing my ground taught me the power of resilience and the importance of community solidarity. Not long after that, I accepted a volunteer position on a newly formed neighborhood advocacy committee. Our purpose was to keep an eye on any major projects and make sure homeowners were properly informed. Although I had zero political aspirations, I thought that being involved might prevent future fiascos. We met in the community center once a month, going over proposals, discussing concerns from neighbors, and ensuring lines of communication stayed open. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt necessary, and in its own way, it was gratifying. We made a real effort to gather feedback from as many homeowners as possible, including those who might not have internet access or the time to attend meetings in person. We printed flyers, organized small gatherings, and answered questions. Gradually, we noticed a shift. People were more engaged, and the board was more cautious about pushing things through without broad support. Meanwhile, Martin pretty much vanished from community life. There were rumors he moved to another neighborhood entirely, or that he was still around but lying low. Linda resigned a few months after Martin left, citing personal reasons. The new board members seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding trust. Although the scars of that battle would always be there, the neighborhood entered a phase of relative harmony. People felt freer to voice their opinions, knowing they wouldn't just be ignored. Every once in a while, I'd think about how easily this story could have gone another way if I hadn't bothered to dig into the records, or if I hadn't found Rachel, who championed my cause with legal expertise. If Paula hadn't texted me about the gravel that day, I might have been too late to stop the construction. If Roger hadn't saved those old city planning documents, we might never have uncovered how the HOA was twisting the original plan. It was a series of fortunate connections, each playing a key role in the ultimate victory. It made me appreciate the phrase, "it takes a village," because truly, I might not have succeeded on my own. By the time the second anniversary of the fiasco rolled around, my backyard looked like nothing had ever happened. The shrubs had grown tall, and new flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. Chester was a bit older, moving a bit slower, but he still liked to romp around, sniffing every nook and cranny. One late afternoon, I found myself recalling the moment I hopped over my fence to confront those construction workers. I remembered that blend of adrenaline and righteous anger, the conviction that I had to protect what was mine. Now, standing there in the gentle light of the setting sun, I felt a wave of gratitude for having followed through on that instinct. Then, as if on cue, Chester nudged me with his nose, and I realized he wanted a treat. Life carried on, anchored by these simple, comforting routines. Sure, the memory of that conflict would forever be etched in my mind, but it no longer weighed me down. Instead, it served as a reminder of my own capacity for courage and perseverance. I never asked for that battle, but I came out of it stronger and more connected to my community. People knew they couldn't just roll over me, or hopefully anyone else, without facing some serious pushback. It was a triumph, yes, but it was also a lesson in how vigilance, unity, and determination can preserve the integrity of a neighborhood. It didn't end there, though. My story spread to other neighborhoods facing similar issues. Through word of mouth, I started getting calls from strangers living in different counties, all wanting advice on how to handle abusive HOA tactics. Some of the stories were heartbreaking. Families threatened with liens because they put up a small garden in their front yard. Retirees harassed for installing a wheelchair ramp that didn't match the approved color scheme. Or parents fined for putting up a basketball hoop for their kids. HOAs, when operated ethically, can help maintain communal standards, but too often they become vehicles for power-hungry boards. My experience showed me how easily that power could be abused, and how vitally important it was for homeowners to stay informed and stand together when something didn't feel right. In one phone call, a tearful woman told me that her HOA had threatened to evict her for not paying a mysterious assessment fee she'd never even heard of before. We spent hours going through her documents, and with my limited knowledge, I was able to point her toward resources that might help. At one point, she said, "You have no idea how hearing your story has given me hope." That struck a chord. I realized that my fight wasn't just a personal victory anymore. It had become a source of inspiration for people battling similar injustices. Even a small glimmer of hope can mean the difference between surrender and resilience. Looking back, the strangest part of this whole ordeal was how it began so quietly. Just a slight noise of construction vehicles at dawn, nothing that alarmed me right away. Often that's how trouble encroaches on our lives, little by little, until suddenly it's at our doorstep. But that's also where vigilance comes in. If there's a key lesson to be learned, it's that standing up for what's right often starts with paying attention to small details. Whether it's noticing tire tracks on your grass or a suspicious clause in a community notice, ignoring it may invite bigger problems. By catching it early, you have a fighting chance. Yes, it can be stressful and scary, especially when you're up against an organization with more resources, but justice can prevail if you're willing to put in the work. A couple of summers later, I decided to expand my garden, planting new varieties of flowers and adding a small koi pond near the spot where the HOA's gravel path once began. Every time I watered those flowers or fed the fish, I'd pause to remember how this patch of earth almost got claimed by someone else. The pond's gentle gurgling now replaced the harsh sound of construction. Where there was once conflict, there was now tranquility. It's strange how something that caused me so much stress could ultimately become a symbol of peace and renewal. I guess that's life's way of reminding us that after every storm, there's potential for growth and beauty, provided we can weather the turmoil. Inevitably, there were a few more minor skirmishes with the HOA in the years that followed. A letter nitpicking about the color of my new mailbox, a complaint that my grass was too long after a rainy spell. But those issues were small potatoes compared to what I'd already been through. I handled them calmly, referencing the bylaws, requesting clarifications, and even attending board meetings to resolve them openly. The board, much changed since the fiasco, often backed down quickly once I reminded them of the new transparency measures. If anything, the experience taught me how to navigate bureaucracy. More importantly, it taught me how to remain firm without allowing anger or fear to consume me. Now here we are, years down the line, and the memory of the road that never was remains a cautionary tale in our community. When new homeowners move in, neighbors sometimes warn them jokingly, "Don't try building a road through that guy's yard. He'll take you to court." We laugh about it, but everyone understands the seriousness behind the joke. It's our little piece of folklore, a demonstration of how in America's suburbia, one seemingly insignificant homeowner can stand up to a powerful board and win, as long as they're on the side of truth. While I never wanted to be the protagonist in such a drama, I can't deny that I take pride in the outcome. When I reflect on it all, what stands out is how important community became in my fight. Initially, I felt alone. The HOA was big and seemingly unstoppable. But once neighbors like Paula and Roger stepped up, once I found a lawyer like Rachel, and once I realized there were others dealing with similar issues, it turned from a solo battle into a collective effort. That sense of camaraderie, the synergy of people pooling resources, experiences, and moral support, was nothing short of transformative. It was as if the adversity forced us to bond, forging a newly strengthened community in the process. Toward the end of every summer, the community organizes a Neighborhood Appreciation Day, where folks bring food, local musicians perform, and children run around collecting candy from various stands. It's an afternoon of unity. The first time I attended after my court victory, a few people raised a glass of lemonade in my direction, silently acknowledging the weight of what had happened. I remember feeling a swell of gratitude so strong I had to blink back tears. It was a stark contrast to the hateful, spray-painted message that once defaced my fence. We had come full circle, from conflict and division to understanding and cooperation. I'm not naive enough to think everything is perfect, but it's a testament to what can happen when a community decides to engage rather than look away. And so, what I want to leave you with, dear listener or reader, is the lesson I learned through all of this. Sometimes you have to fight for what is rightfully yours. It won't always be easy or pleasant. You might lose sleep, face intimidation, and question your own sanity. But if you believe in what you're fighting for, and if you gather allies who share your conviction, you stand a much better chance of prevailing. There's a deep satisfaction in asserting your rights, especially when you do it not just for yourself, but for the larger principle at stake. It's about preserving what's fair, what's just, and what truly belongs to you and your loved ones. Whether you're battling a powerful organization, confronting an injustice at work, or simply trying to protect your family's peace, the essence remains the same. Stand firm, seek truth, And don't let fear paralyze you. You might think you're too small or too isolated to make a difference. Trust me, I felt that way many times, especially when facing a whole board of people determined to push me aside. But the law, when used correctly, can be a shield, and the power of a united community can amplify a single voice into a resounding chorus. If you find the right people, gather the right evidence, and stay vigilant, you can indeed fight back against forces that seem far bigger than yourself. My saga with the HOA was living proof of that. I believe that's the underlying moral I want to share. Never underestimate your own capacity to spark change, even when the odds appear daunting, and never believe that something is too small or too trivial to stand up for. Your home, your livelihood, your sense of security, these matter immensely. Even if the battle is messy and complicated, even if it drags on longer than you thought possible, don't let discouragement win. Stand up, speak out, gather allies, and push forward, because sometimes all it takes is one determined person to expose fraud, shine a light on corruption, and restore a sense of justice to a whole community. That, my friends, is the story of how the HOA built a road through my property and never expected me to fight back, let alone win. They sure got a surprise when I refused to roll over, and in the end, beyond the legal papers, the court orders, and the reconstructed yard, the deeper victory was learning that persistence, unity, and truth can prevail over intimidation and deceit. Though the experience was stressful, it taught me invaluable lessons about community, justice, and the power of standing up for yourself. And in our final moments together, let me leave you with the philosophical lesson I treasure most. True ownership goes beyond the deed to your home. It resides in your willingness to protect what is dear to your heart. Whether it's property, principles, or the well-being of your neighbors, safeguarding those things requires courage and resolve. It's easy to go along with the crowd, to assume that larger entities always know best. But if you feel a tug of injustice, if you see that something doesn't add up, dare to ask questions. Dare to say, no, this isn't right, because as daunting as it might seem, that one small word, backed by evidence and determination, can upend even the most formidable opponents, especially when the law and ethical principles are on your side. That's the real power we hold as individuals and as communities. Use it wisely, and don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise.